I thought I'd explore spiritism and society, and current society. And the reason behind this was that on the one hand, we have the spiritist belief that we're born with an inner sense of what is right and wrong, and we have the freedom of choice, and we understand that we will suffer the consequences or the rewards of those choices. But on the other hand, we have society which imposes certain restrictions on us. And I wanted to explore how these two overlap, interact, maybe contradict. So the theme I taught today is actually crime and punishment. I'm not going to talk about Dostoevsky's famous novel, but I'm really going to look at the societal laws through a spiritist perspective. And I've set out the talk in basically 6 parts. The first part, I'm going to look a little bit about violence and crime from a historical perspective. And the reason is I think we live in an age where news is just so abundant and particularly bad news. I'm sure today there was an event in Rio where prisoners revolted in the prison and hundreds were killed. I guarantee half of us before we got home will probably know about it. And that's the problem, we tend to hear all the bad news. So we'll look at the violence and history from a historical perspective. And in fact, there's a lot of evidence out there, and I hope I'll convince you that we're living really in terms, relative terms, in perhaps the most peaceful time in the history of the human race. Talk a little bit about the background to some of the societal laws we have today. And even though most countries in the world are secular, in that there's a separation of state from the formal religions, a lot of our laws are really based on some of the premises that were given to us in the Bible and so on. And we'll just briefly touch on that. Then we'll talk about the Spiritist perspective, and I'm going to focus in on chapter 3 of the Spirit's book, which talks about the moral laws. And the Spirit's book has over 1,000 questions and answers, but almost a third of the book is actually on the moral laws. And there's 300 questions in there. And I went through those and tried to pull out questions that really shed light onto the topic I'm trying to address today. I'm going to talk about capital punishment. I'm trying to be very objective here in giving the facts both for and against. I'm sure all of us here have a certain opinion on the subject, but I want to try and reflect that with what the Spiritist view is. In fact, it was interesting last week, Robert Blakely briefly touched on that subject, and I had an opportunity to talk to him afterwards, and he gave me some very good input, which I put included in here today. And I'm briefly going to talk about incarceration. Particularly here in the US, we have a major problem here in the US, where in fact the society here is probably the biggest jail in the world in terms of the incarcerated population, and I think that's a concern. Certainly it's a concern to me. I want to share that with you, and then finally we'll come to some conclusions, and hopefully there'll be time for discussion. I go back to particularly, the sections 4 and 5 are a little more polemic than our normal topics here at the centre, but I hope it will at least provoke some discussion and some thought. So we'll start off with the violence and crime. I took from my source a talk by Dr. Steven Pinker. It's a TED talk. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the TED Talks, but in fact this year is the 30th anniversary of TED Talks. When they first started, they were actually technology, education and design. Not education, entertainment and design. And for the first few years nothing really happened, but in about the 90s the group was taken over by Chris Anderson, who currently runs it, and expanded the theme to include ideas worth spreading. And I really recommend, if you haven't visited the TED website, they now have over 1,600 videos. Each video is a maximum of 18 minutes, that's the rules of the game. You have 18 minutes to present a theme, an idea worth spreading. So I took this talk, and the title of the talk was The Surprising Declines of Violence. And again, when we think about what's happening in the world, particularly when we reflect on the violence that we see on our television screen every day, you think we were living in really the most violent time in the history of mankind, and that's not true. Even when we look at the last century with the 2 world wars, Vietnam and the genocides in Cambodia and so on, and even into this century, Steven Pinker talked about Darfur in Iraq. He gave this talk in 2007. I've added to that the atrocities in Sudan and Syria, and the Central African Republic. And closer to home, of course, we're familiar with the suicide bombers and Newtown, and there's a whole mass of violence out there. But again, in reality, you compare with our ancestors, we're actually living in a very peaceful time. He called the decline in violence a fractal phenomenon. He's looking at it in a logarithmic scale, and the same pattern appears. And I'm going to present evidence over thousands of years, hundreds, tens, and then finally years. And there was a tipping point at the age of reason. This is when humankind started to question the rule of the monarchies and the church. It's evident all over the world to varying degrees, but particularly in the West. And specifically, when we look at some of the records in Europe, particularly England and Holland, at the era of Enlightenment. And again, the era of Enlightenment was the precursor to really Allan Kardec's work. We'll see more evidence still. So let's start with the millennium scale. 10,000 years ago, we were all pretty much hunter-gatherers, living from day to day. And obviously there was no written record at the time. The only records we have are the archaeological records. And Lawrence Keeley did a lot of work looking at archaeological records, so remains, bones, etc., of tribes in various parts of the world that the tribes actually no longer exist anymore. But he was able to ascertain that the huge rate, a high rate of 15 up to even as much as 60% of the deaths were caused by homicide rather than natural causes. Even in the Old Testament, there are many references to genocide. Particularly there's one in Numbers 31. Moses said to the people, "Arm some of your men and go to war against the Midianites, so they may carry out the Lord's vengeance on them." And in fact, the passage goes on to say that an army of about 3,000 soldiers were sent out. They plundered the town, killed all the men, brought back the women and children, the boys, and the spoils, and they brought them back to Moses. And again, from the Bible, Moses asked, "Have you killed all the men?" And the response was, "No, kill the boys and kill every woman who has slept with a man, but save for yourselves every girl who has never slept with a man." Again, I think it's just illustrative of the violence of that time. And there's many other references in the Old Testament to the same ilk. When we go on to the century scale, now we're getting more into more written documentation of what happened in the Middle Ages, but numerous practices of slavery and amputation, people losing the hand because they stole a loaf of bread. And Manuel Eisner, he's a criminologist at Cambridge University in England, he was able to go back into the records of Europe because every hamlet and village and town and city started to keep records of births and marriages and deaths. And he went into those records and put together this graph, and it shows you the amazing decline of homicide. This is the vertical scale is homicides per 100,000 per year. And you can see the trend, particularly the tipping point again around the 16th, 17th century. One of the reasons he put forward at the time was, again, the transfer of knowledge from being monopolized by the monarchies and the church. And when the books started to be produced, and this is just a record of book production in Europe, you can see as the knowledge increases, then the homicide rate decreases. And there's more than just a coincidence there. When we go on to the decay scale, the scale of decay is comprehensive data, and goes on to say that global violence has fallen steadily since the middle of the 20th century. Human Society Brief is a report that's put out every year that actually tracks the deaths from wars. And this is a graph that shows the deaths from after the Second World War to, in this case, 2006. You can see the peaks here, the Korean War, Vietnam War, Iran-Iraq War, and so on. But the trend is definitely positive. And finally, on the year scale, since the end of the Cold War, there's been a steep drop-off in state-based conflicts. And those that do occur are no more likely to end in negotiated settlements rather than being fought to the bitter end. I think we got an example of this these last few days in Ukraine, where, you know, from a apparent position of total chaos and anarchy, it looks like this revolution is going to be made and will come to hopefully a good ending. Again, another political scientist showed that number of mass killings decreased by about 90%. That's the good news. The bad news in the US, there was an increase, an upturn in homicides in the 60s. This is a graph, it's taken slightly out of context, but it shows that from the 60s there was a huge increase, almost a doubling of homicides in the US. And this is, again, Michael Eisner, but he was saying that, you know, and he put forward what could be done to bring it down to the levels that are in Europe. You can see how much higher we are still than Europe. Okay, so that's very briefly a history of violence and crime. Let's talk a little bit about societal laws, and we'll start with Moses. Again, from that Numbers 31, he's not quite the grey, cuddly old man leading his people to the promised land, but he did go up Mount Sinai and came back with the Ten Commandments. And the Ten Commandments really have influenced, I think, all the laws in the world. Having said that, when he came back from the mountain, the story in the Bible goes that basically his people thought he wasn't coming back, miscounted the days or whatever. They melted down all the gold they had and made a calf, a golden calf, and started to worship that. And, you know, that really contravened the second law. In his rage, he smashed those tablets. But the good news is he was able to go back up the mountain and find 2 new tablets. So it looks a bit like Stephen Jobs, but anyway. And of course, the Jewish, going forward a few hundred years now, the Torah incorporated all the Ten Commandments and many, many other laws. And that is probably the first of the basic laws of society. Still, in fact, you know, from Orthodox Jews' point of view, it still is the basic document on how to run your life, and covers everything from how to cook and obeying the Sabbath and so on. And then, of course, we'll go on 1,200 years to the time of Jesus. And actually, who was it? It was Eduardo a couple of weeks ago talked very, very well about the Sermon on the Mount. And that really, in the 3 years that Jesus was alive, he left us so much teaching. I just want to pull out 1 or 2 things here. His Sermon on the Mount was, some say, a commentary on the Ten Commandments. Whether it replaced or fulfilled or completed the law of Moses is up to debate. But the greatest commandment about loving the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, with all thy mind, was expanded to include love thy neighbor as thyself. And this was the start of opening up a society as we know it. The Beatitude contained many, many pointers in how we should run society. The focus on love and humility rather than force and exaction, and turning the other cheek rather than an eye for an eye. So again, following Jesus, there's other documents, the Quran, there's other many, many documents around the world. We haven't time to go into that, but okay, so that's really the backdrop that I want to talk about, and then we get into the real, I call the meat of the discussion, and this is the societal laws and from a Spiritist perspective. The Spirit's book, 150 years this year. Chapter part 3 is the moral laws, and there's 12 moral laws. As I said earlier, I went through those and I tried to pull out some that I think illustrate the point I'm trying to make today. And what I'm going to start with actually is the law of society. It's the shortest of the, I think there's only about 6 questions in that chapter, but I think it's very important, and I want to start with that one to show you why I think so. Law of destruction, and we'll go into that, is actually in 4 parts within that, and I'm going to pull out some of the parts that reflect on the subject today. Then the law of progress, and then the law of justice. So today we live in a society of 7 billion plus in the world. And it's interesting when you reflect to the time of Moses, there was probably less than 100 million, maybe half a billion at the time of Jesus. So we've grown tenfold. So I'm sure a lot of us have come from Capella or other places in the world. So the reason you can logistically explain that away. But we're made up of a society of many, many individuals, many religions, many cultures. So just to illustrate a point, I want to talk about this individual here. I'm going to call him Marcello. Any resemblance to Marcello we know is purely coincidental. But he was born into a Spiritist family. And again, as I said earlier, he understands that his DNA came 50% from his mother and father, but he believes that he brought with him elements of his character, his spirit, that came from his past reincarnations. He also believes that he has those elements contain the sense of what is good and evil, the virtues and vices and so on, and he really strives to run his life in function of those principles. But he also understands he has the choice, freedom of choice, and he will suffer the consequences of his decisions. Talk about, let's call her Maria up here. She was born in Alabama to a very wealthy white family whose parents used to own a tobacco plantation with slaves many generations ago. She's still a very religious person, but has some strong views on race, whether the Latinos coming over the border. She has concerns. And then let's talk about little Billy down here. Billy was born in the Bronx. His father abused him when he was a child. He was an alcoholic. Then she left home. He was left with his mother. His mother turned to drugs. During his teens, he started to get into violent ways, selling drugs as a means of survival. So we have all these individuals. And again, the idea of showing you this and trying to set up is how we reconcile Marcello's beliefs and how society has to impose, obviously, constraints and has a responsibility and obligation to protect other members of the society. So going into the Spirits book, we'll talk about the law of society first. And this I found very interesting in that I pulled out 3 questions here. And the first one is 766. Is societal law life natural? And the answer came back, yes, God, certainly. God has made humans for living in society. Otherwise, it would have been needless for God to have endowed them with speech and all the other faculties necessary for the life of relationships. And again, these are the key points here. Just digressing slightly, I remember coming here about 18 months ago and seeing Daniel Assisi give a talk, and he referred to God as the grand old dude, and that really stuck with me ever since. I always liked that. Daniel also introduced me to this Prezi software, and if you haven't bought your tickets, by the way, he's coming in a couple of weeks, so please come to the convention here in March. And again, Kardec, you see a lot of instances of this where he asks a question and then he asks the opposite question to the spirits and try to get a bit more depth out of the answers. So he's talked about societal law, but he then talks about his absolute isolation, contrary to the law of nature. And yes, because people instinctively seek out societal living, and because all of them must cooperate in humankind's progress by mutually helping one another. And again, this is why we're here. We're here to learn from one another and to love one another, to tolerate, and to exercise charity. And finally, just the last question here. In seeking a societal living, do people only obey a personal sentiment, or is there a wider providential purpose involved? Humans must progress. They cannot do so alone. However, since they do not all possess every faculty, they need contact with others. In isolation, they become brutish and withered. We go back to the hunter-gatherer stage. So we really are here to live together. Law of destruction. Again, this is in 4 parts. Necessary and abusive destruction. Is destruction a law of nature? And the spirits came back to say, it is necessary for everything to be destroyed in order to be reborn and regenerated. What you call destruction is no more than transformation that is aimed at renewing and improving living things. Transformation, there's so many different dimensions to the word. Based on the time I have, I got a little quote here from, I read again Deepak Chopra book on Ageless Body, Timeless Mind. And in the opening, he talks about how the human body transforms. Our stomach lining is replaced, the atoms we breathe in and out replaced every 5 days, our skin replaced every 6 weeks. In 1 year from now, every atom in your body will not be here today, they're all new. So our whole body is going through continual transformation. But in this context, we talk in the spiritist context, we talk about inner transformation, about learning to leave the material world and focus on our inner selves and our spiritual development. And in this context here, he's talking about transformation of society, and we've seen that, how the laws develop, how violence become more humane and violence decreases. Will the need for destruction always exist for humankind on the earth? The need for destruction diminishes amongst humans to the degree that their spirit overcomes matter. That is why you may observe that the horror of destruction falls upon intellectual and moral development. So you have to read that a couple of times, but basically saying that, 500 years ago, seeing a person having his hand chopped off for stealing a loaf of bread was common. There's no problem. But today, obviously, we'd see that as horrific. He also talks about war. What's the current cause that leads to war? And the answer from the spirits: the predominance of the animal nature over the spiritual, and the satisfaction of their passions. He goes on to say, as humans evolve, war will become less frequent since they'll avoid its causes. And again, the graph I showed earlier, I think, illustrates that point. Will war someday disappear from the face of the earth? Yes, when men and women understand the justice and practice of God's law, then all nations will live as brothers and sisters. He also talks about murder, and we'll go into this more in detail in the next section, but is murder a crime in God's sight? Yes, a great crime, because those who take the life of another fellow being thereby cut short a life of expiation or mission, hence the evil. I think it's neither one nor the other. I think we all have an element of expiation and also a mission in life. And he specifically asked a question about the death penalty. Will the death penalty someday disappear from human legislation? The death penalty will surely disappear, and its suppression will signal progress for humankind. When humans become more enlightened, the death penalty will be completely abolished on the earth. There will no longer be need to be judged by others. I speak of a time which is still very distant from you. Well, I think which we'll see later on, in the last 150 years, we've made a lot of progress. And talking about progress, in the law of progress, he talks about human legislation. Could society be governed solely by natural laws without having to resort to human laws? It could if human beings understood them well enough. If they were to actually practice them, such laws would be sufficient. Society, however, has its requirements and needs special laws. A harsh criminal law is a necessity in the present state of society. A depraved society has a need for harsher laws. Unfortunately, such laws are meant to punish a wrong after it's already been committed, rather than to cut out the root of what caused the problem. Only education can reform humankind, who will then have no more need for such harsh laws. Of course, the key is education and re-education. How can humankind reform its laws? Will care naturally through the force of circumstances and by the influence of moral persons who will guide them along the path of progress. And we've seen many examples, I think, in the past, and Gandhi and many other figures that have come into the world and helped us progress in terms of our moral laws, our societal laws. And finally, just the law of justice talks about human rights. How may justice be defined? Simply, justice consists of respecting the right of others. Very simple. And what determines these rights? They're determined by two things: the human law and the natural law. Human laws have established rights that can vary with progress. They only regulate certain relations, whereas the private life, there is a huge number of actions that are the exclusive jurisdiction of the court of conscience. I just love this phrase. We're all carrying around a little judge, jury in our head, and that's what hopefully will make us choose the right decisions as we go through life. Does the necessity of living in society impose obligation on humankind? Yes, and the first of all is that of respecting the rights of others. Okay, so I now want to go into a more maybe controversial area, and that's capital punishment. Sometimes our system in the world is somewhat blind and has blood on its hands. Why do we kill people who kill people to show that killing people is wrong? I think that's a very apt question to ask. Again, just talking a little bit about the history. Capital punishment, the word capital, by the way, comes from the Latin capitalis, which is of the head, because the old ways of dealing with capital punishment were like beheading or hanging. In England, in 1950, capital offences include not just murder, but other treason, larceny, etc. And then in the 1950s, again in the age of enlightenment, people started to question some of the French philosopher Voltaire, the Italian judge Beccaria, and other English reformers started to question. And they argued that the death penalty was needlessly cruel, overrated as a deterrent, and occasionally imposed in fatal error. And I think those three elements still are very valid today if you're on the side of against capital punishment. First two countries to abolish it were Venezuela and Portugal. Actually, Michigan was the first US state. That was even before that. The US went, basically, the law of capital punishment is on a state-by-state basis. There was a period of 4 years where the Supreme Court did temporarily put a moratorium on capital punishment, but then it went back to the states. And Britain was since 1965. Since then, the UN has adopted different resolutions, non-binding. About 2/3 of the nations on the planet who participate in the United Nations agreed on that moratorium, that resolution. But other countries, including US, China, Japan, quite a few countries in Asia, Middle East, Africa, still exercise capital punishment. Just a few quick things I'm going to throw out. Ethically acceptable. No state has the absolute right to put its worst criminals to death, although the majority of the states may wish to confer that right upon it. And in fact, a majority of people in this country, and even in Europe, where the death penalty has been abolished, there's still quite a strong support of bringing back the death penalty. And if we live accept that we live in a democratic society, there's still a possibility that one day that might come back. Another fact is, I found this very interesting when I was looking through the information to put together this talk. We overlook the fact that we're ultimately all going to die. We go to the doctor and we find we have cancer and have 2 years to live. We've got a death penalty on us. We've got a death threat, and it's going to happen. So, sometimes the other side of the coin is, that is life. Life is death. Some of the arguments against the death penalty, there's basically 4 basic arguments. One is retribution, that the punishment should fit the crime. And that's probably one of the strongest arguments for the death penalty camp. Deterrence, knowing that you will be, if you commit a murder, the chances are you possibly can be put to death. I think in reality that doesn't happen. I think the point this last week in Florida, where a person was charged with first-degree murder for shooting a black teenager in the car because the music was so high. In fact, he was downgraded to a second-degree murder charge in the end. But again, did he think, if I kill this boy, I'm going to get put in, I could lose my life as well? I don't think so. Incapacitation. There's been many instances of death row inmates who have killed other inmates, have killed wardens, have escaped and killed outside. So at least by taking out that element of society, you protect the rest of society, and that's one of the arguments for the death penalty. And costs, it's cost of the alternative, the cost of keeping someone alive for the rest of his life without parole is phenomenal on society. On the other hand, arguments against the death penalty, there's a certainty that certain innocent people will be executed, and since the advance of DNA testing, there's been many, many cases. And I think that's probably the strongest argument in my opinion. You make your own opinion, but I think the fact that we could innocently kill an innocent person is a very big no-no. Second reason, often overlooked, is suffering of the family and friends of criminals who go through the suffering knowing that their family member will be executed. Always a concern that the state can administer the death penalty justly. Some of our juridical system in the US has put a bias on those families who can afford good lawyers. There's lots of distortion of witnesses. The cases drag on for years, and witnesses' memories become less and less. So, and even when we get to the method of putting a person to death. There's a lot of controversy. In fact, most of the delays on death row today are because of the argument that it should be a humane death, and whether through injection, lethal injection is the way to go. It's getting more and more difficult. In fact, some of the manufacturers are refusing to sell one or more of the components that make up that 5 lethal injection. And the death penalty is the bluntest of blunt instrument. It removes the individual's humanity, and without it, any chance of rehabilitation and giving something back to society. So again, to go back to a spiritist perspective, things like suicide, abortion, euthanasia, death penalty is one of the chapters. And I've just pulled out, with the help of my dear wife to help me with the translation, some of the elements that she brings to, I think, shows very clearly that it's the death penalty from the perspective is a no-no. Life is too precious to be cut short by any individual or state representative, no matter how barbaric or vile the crime. Every criminal has a right to access resources to facilitate an inner transformation, again the word transformation again, to become a better person, both for himself and society. Educate and re-educate are unavoidable needs. Kill never. The death of the criminal doesn't return the life of the victim. The objective of societal laws should be to eliminate crime and the root causes of crime, not the criminal. And this last part I think was very important. Death does not destroy life. Freeing the criminal from the material body, inflaming hate in the final moments, creating permanent torment for the spirit which can spread to both the spirit and material worlds. And that's the torment that will leave a death row inmate with that hate, and not they can't see through that hate to see what their past crimes were. Okay, so I'm near the end. Incarceration, I just want to just talk a little bit about incarceration here in the US. And I'm going to show a few graphs just to show the state the US is in. This is actually a little bit old, 2008. The latest figures are a lot higher, but you can see that the United States is the world's leading jailer. This is by population, prisoners per 100,000 population. We're now about 10 times higher than Europe and most of the developed countries in Europe. And this is the rise of the population, federal prison population, both state and federal. And the reason this occurred here was obviously as a response, and we'll come on to that in a minute, but the response to the increase in homicide rates. This is the total population, either probation, in prison. You're talking about 10 million, or about 3% of the population in the US. So if we're 30 people here, one of us statistically has been involved in a crime or has been in jail. It's frighteningly high numbers. The other sad part of it is that when you look at the demographics and you look at males 18 to 29, which is the major demographic of the prison population, it's disproportionately against the blacks by a factor of 5, much more than the population of blacks in the demographic. And then also you look at the cost. The cost has not only been rising, but you look at the cost of policing and tracking down criminals and gathering evidence, look at the cost of the correction facilities, look at the cost of the judge and jury system that we have. You're talking huge, huge dollars and money that would be better spent. Just to give you an example, in California, more money is spent per prisoner than is spent in higher education by the state. And that is a trend that's continuing. So the reason, again, I mentioned it earlier, the knee-jerk reaction to the rise in homicides. Another factor was the mandatory minimum sentencing law. The judge can no longer have the freedom, depending on the pros and cons of an individual, to adjust the sentence. In a lot of states, there is a minimum sentence and that's it. Some states have adopted this 3 strikes law. So people can get actually 30 years for shoplifting 3 times, and that has happened. And most of the prison population is actually non-violent. A lot of it is obviously drug related. About 30-40% of that are just basically being caught with possession of drugs or dealing in drugs. And lastly, this is another factor that is very disturbing. A lot of the states are going to privatizing the prison system. And some of these contracts are written with a minimum occupancy rate, because that's how they'll maintain their return. And so the state has more incentive to fill it up, because we're going to have to pay for it anyway. Okay, well I'm throwing that out there as a bit of a primer for thought and discussion. Finally, I just want to conclude with a few thoughts. Levels of violence decrease as society develops and societal laws adopt to reflect the progress. And I think we've seen good, strong evidence of that. Natural laws will become more accepted in practice, and the need for human laws will be reduced and eventually eliminated. So hopefully we'll see a time when we all follow the natural laws that the gospel tells us and taught us, and we study in Spiritism, and the need for laws outside of that will be eliminated. I think the death penalty should be abolished. Not everyone might agree, but that's my point of view. And incarceration of criminals should be provided an opportunity for education. Much work needs to be done in this regard, particularly in the USA. So with that said, I'm both prosecution and defense, and I'm going to rest my case. Thank you very much.